project risk management. Of course, managing risk is a very important part of managing any project, because unless we think about the risks and put in place strategies to manage them, our project could quite easily fail. So it's something that is a very important part of project management. So what is a risk? Well, a risk is a chance of something happening that will have a negative effect on the project or its outcomes. So it's something that's going to really knock us around if it happens. And the level of risk reflects the likelihood of the unwanted event and also the potential consequences of the event. So that means there's two aspects to risk: the probability that it will actually happen and the impact to our project if it does happen. So this is what we need to ascertain when we're planning for risk as we start our project. Now, the first thing we need to consider is the context of risk in our own organisation and project. Some projects or organisations are what we call risk averse. That means they don't want negative things to happen on the project, particularly where there's safety considerations and financial considerations involved. So it's important that we manage those things. So construction is a good example of a risk-averse industry. A risk-neutral organisation or project is something where the risks are fairly small. We don't have impacts on people's safety to any great extent, and the risks themselves may be quite low in terms of financial impact. And a good example of that may be a website development for your organisation. And finally, the other type of context is risk seeking. Now, organisations that are risk seeking tend to be research and development type of organisations or projects. And a good example of that would be Richard Branson's recent space travel project, which was, a very risky thing, but that's that whole exercise is risk seeking. They understand the risks. Obviously, they need to try and manage them, but they're willing to spend a lot of money on risk and are aware of the potential outcomes of that. So just think about that in terms of risk. Every organisation is different as to how they perceive risk. Now, at the beginning of your project, you should do risk planning, and that's absolutely essential to think about the risks that may impact you going forward on your project. And if by doing that and doing a good risk plan, it means you're going to have fewer surprises on your project, and you'll be able to minimize negative impacts on time, cost, quality, and safety. And this will also give you a greater probability of having a successful outcome from your project. Now, we're going to talk about the steps involved in planning risk. And the first thing we need to do is identify the risks associated with our project. And some common risks that may impact us are things like safety hazards that lead to worker accidents in industries, incomplete drawings and poorly defined scope. That means that your plans and specifications aren't very well done in the first place and may contain errors. And of course, that's very risky from a financial perspective. Unknown site conditions, that can mean, things like there could be buried asbestos or unknown rock formations under the ground, which could cause us a lot of delays and extra cost. Unclear contracts. This it's a very important thing to think about, because your contract should be very clear and cover all the different points involved in your arrangement with whom you are contracting. Now, if a contract is unclear, that is going to lead to disputes, and of course disputes cost money and can also impact other areas of your project depending on what the dispute is. Unexpected increases in material costs. You know, you might be importing materials from overseas, so you need to think about how you're going to manage unexpected increases in those material costs caused by currency fluctuation, or sometimes we even find that certain materials just suddenly increase in price because of scarcity, etc. And as far as currency fluctuation is concerned, then it's important to do hedging your finance so that you're paying a known price. And different material costs, they can increase, so you need to think about what you'll do about that eventually happening. Labour shortages, that this can happen quite a lot where there's an excess of work in an industry, or labour is diverted to another industry that's booming. Damage or theft to equipment and tools, always a risk to projects where you have expensive equipment and tools on site. And of course, natural disasters such as floods and bushfires, etc., which could impact your project. So that's just a list of some common risks. Of course, there are lots of others, and this is the whole idea of sitting down and identifying risk at the beginning of the project. So you need to ensure that as many risks as possible are identified. And one way of making things a little bit simpler is to separate risks into different categories. And some examples of different categories are work health and safety and environmental risks, project delivery risks, such as things that might impact the site of the project, things like the land that I mentioned before. It could be unexpected conditions on the site. It could be excessive rain, which causes flooding on the site, etc. All of those things can be project delivery risks. Also, the cost of materials, etc. Contractual risks are all around your agreement with contractors. And of course, making sure you need to make sure that your contract is crystal clear. Otherwise, as I said before, there can be disputes which can cause all sorts of financial and delays to your to your project. So lots of problems can emanate from contractual situations. Now, the best way to identify risks for your project is by conducting a risk workshop. Now, large organisations often bring in external facilitators to facilitate risk workshops, particularly when it comes to work health and safety, because there are facilitators who are expert on this, and many large organisations engage them to get that extra confidence that they've covered those things, because obviously they're really, really important. But ideas for risk identification can also can come from past projects, looking at the risk profile and the risk identification for previous projects, and also what went wrong on previous projects. Risk checklists. Now, they're very good to develop or have in your organisation, and if you don't have them now, it's a good idea to develop them, because for every project you'll accumulate some more risks, and it's a good idea to put them into a risk checklist, and you can set up the risk checklist by category of risks, and that's a great way to A, save time, and B, make sure that you don't forget things. And of course, once you've been through your risk checklist, you can then think about any other specific risks that might apply to your particular project. And of course, involving subject matter experts in the risk workshop. So the first thing you do is have a risk identification session. Don't worry about how you're going to resolve those risks at this point. The whole idea is to think about all the risks that might happen on your project and obtain a list. So the first risk workshop should only focus on identifying risks. Now, once you've got a huge list of risks, the next thing you need to do is to analyze and prioritize them. And this means that you need to determine how important that risk is. And that's what we mean about prioritizing, because we want to deal with the most important risks first and put a lot of effort into managing those, and then work down the list. So we're going to determine which are the most important risks. And the way we do that is asking ourselves, first of all, well, what's the likelihood that the risk will occur? And what's the impact if it does occur? And we always use little risk analysis matrix, and you'll see various versions of these in the industry, and you may have some in your own organization already. This is a very simple one, but it's very effective. But you may want to be a bit more granular, and you might have very low, medium, high and extreme as different impacts and likelihoods, but you can see at this risk matrix on the vertical axis we've got impacts, low, medium and high, and on the horizontal axis we've got likelihood, low, medium and high. So for any risk that we're looking at, we need to say, well, what is the impact of this risk if it happens? So it might be, this is subjective, of course. It might be that we consider it to be a medium impact to our project. And what's the likelihood that it will happen? What's the probability? Well, that might be high that it will happen. So if we look at this matrix, we say, well, we've got a medium impact and a high likelihood, and therefore we're going to rate this risk as a high risk because it is quite likely that it will happen. We go through all the risks, and we may have some that are low likelihood that they will happen, and also fairly low impact on the project. So they come out as insignificant. And of course, at the highest extreme is that if we've got a high impact on the project and a high likelihood that it would happen, we end up with what we call an extreme risk. Now, this enables us to then rank all the risks in their overall ratings or rankings. And so we put them in order. This enables us then to think about those risks, the most important risks first. Of course, if we've got any extreme risks, we shouldn't move forward with our project if there's an extreme risk, because that means that it's really going to impact the likelihood of success for our project. And even high risks, we need to think about how we can bring those down to a lower level so that they can become medium or low risks. So with our risk analysis later on, we're always thinking about how we can reduce the ranking of that risk. So we start with this overall ranking that we've assigned to our risks, and then we move on to developing what we call treatment strategies. So what are we going to do to manage this risk? Now, there are various ways that we can manage risks, and they fall into 4 different categories. The first one is to avoid the risk. That is, do something to remove it. An example is that you might have a supplier and you find out that they're perhaps having some financial troubles, and you're a bit worried about the fact that they may not be able to deliver the goods or services to you because of this problem. They may go broke, and that could have quite a big impact on your project. So to do something to remove it, you might decide to find another supplier that you know is a bit more robust financially. So that's just an example of avoiding the risk. The other thing you can do is transfer the risk, and that means making someone else responsible for the risk. The risk doesn't go away altogether, but you are transferring the responsibility for managing the risk to someone else. And that's a couple of examples there. Is the first one is that by outsourcing work to a more experienced organisation and allowing them to take responsibility for that part of the work, you're transferring the risk of failure to that organisation. So that you still have a slight risk of failure, but you're transferring that to them because they are going to take full responsibility for delivery. Another way of transferring risk is through insurance. So you can pay an insurance premium to cover the event in case that risk occurs. You still need to pay the premium, and you may have to pay an excess if the risk occurs, but it will cost you a lot less to manage that risk. It will have less impact on your project. Now, a good example of that would be work cover. You're paying a premium to work cover to cover all the employees and workers on your project. And so that covers you in case they have an accident, unless, of course, you are found to be negligent. Now, the third category is mitigating the risk, and this is the most common way we manage risks. And this means taking action to lessen the impact of what happens if that risk occurs, lessen the impact, or lessen the probability of it happening. So it means we're going to try and lower that risk in that risk table we saw before. So, for example, if there's a risk of theft at our site, and you need security at your site over and above fencing, so you can actually mitigate that risk by installing things like CCTV cameras or hiring security guards. So that's a way of mitigating the risk if you've got security risks at your site. And finally, accepting the risk. Now, your risk might be so small, it's got a low probability of happening and very little impact if it does happen. Then you say, well, we'll accept that and we'll keep it on our list, but we're not going to put time and energy into managing that risk because it's insignificant. And we'll say we'll keep monitoring it to see if it changes, but we won't put any effort into managing that risk in any way. And if it does happen, we will probably work out what to do at the time. So they're the 4 different types of risk treatment strategies that you can apply. So as you need another workshop Again, you would have had a workshop to prioritize the risks after you identified them, and then you have workshops to develop treatment strategies. So you've got a few risk workshops to have. It's the first time that when you're starting a project, to come up with a comprehensive treatment plan for your risks. And of course, all this needs to be documented. And we document it in what we call a project risk register. And project risk registers can be as simple or complex as you like, but this is typical of a fairly normal risk register. So you should put down, give every risk a number and the date it was raised, a description of the risk, and in that description, you should, in words, detail what would happen on your project if that risk did occur. Then you do your ratings. So going back to that table, look at the likelihood of the risk occurring, which in this case is low. This is legal action, delays or pauses project. So the likelihood would be low. The impact, if it happens, would be medium, in your opinion. And therefore, the overall risk ranking based on that little matrix we had would be medium. Now, the person who's going to manage that risk would, in this case, would be the project sponsor. So the project sponsor is the person the project manager reports to, who's normally a key executive in your organization. Now, if you have your own business, then you're it. You're everything. So always assign a risk to somebody to manage. As a project manager, don't take on all the risks yourself to manage. You should assign them to the people who've got the most expertise to manage them. And also, it lessens the load on you as well. The next thing is to document the treatment or the actions you're going to implement to deal with that risk. So in this case, we say ensure all contracts are signed before starting the project, follow all regulatory requirements and complete stakeholder management plan. Another way this could there could be other managements you could put in place is to ensure that you get the contract vetted by a third party to make sure there aren't any inconsistencies in it or something like that. And then you should look at the progress on any actions regarding your risk treatments. So in this case, we've got the contracts issued and the status is open. So you can see that a risk register can be quite simple, and you might want to divide up your risk registers into the categories. Typically, you would always have a separate category or risk register for work health and safety, because that is quite large area of concern, and then to have another risk register for all the other risks and divide those into categories. So if you're using Excel, you can even have different tabs for each category of risk, and that means that you can look at them and focus on a particular type of risk. Makes it just easier to manage. Now, managing risks actually costs money. When you put treatment strategies in place, normally those treatment strategies will cost money. Now, if you're going to put a treatment strategy in place at the beginning of the project while you're planning it, then you will include the cost of that risk treatment in your budget for the project. Now, an example of that might be when you've decided to change a supplier, for example, because, as I said, you're going to transfer the risk, or you're going to avoid the risk by using another supplier who is more financially stable. Now, it might be that the supplier that you originally chose was a lot cheaper. And this often happens when people are in financial trouble. They're actually undercut the prices of other suppliers or contractors. And the reason for that is to try and stimulate their cash flow. So always be wary of quotes that are very cheap. Ask yourself, why are they so cheap? So it could be something like cash flow, or it could be that they're providing poor quality service or products. But anyway, if you decide to move to another supplier or contractor, it might be that they are more expensive, but you figure that that's worthwhile to avoid the risk of the other one. So obviously, if the new supplier is more expensive, you will build that into your budget at the beginning of the project, that extra cost. Now, if you only need to spend the money if a certain event occurs, you need, and that we call that a trigger point. So that event that could occur to trigger our risk treatment is called a trigger point. And this could be, for example, that you've dug the foundations, you've excavated, you've got a really deep hole because you're going to have underground parking for some townhouses. So you've got this enormous deep hole, and then we have torrential rain. And then, of course, that will be a risk that you will have torrential rain at the point of the foundations or the excavation being dug. Now, you know that you will have to hire pumps to pump out the water. So the rain would be the trigger event, but you will need money to hire the pumps to pump the water out of the hole. So you know how much that's going to cost you. So you need to put that money aside in a contingency bucket, into a bucket of money to spend on risk management. And we call that a risk reserve. So remember, for any risk which you're going to spend money on during the project, if it happens, then you need to put money aside for that expenditure. Now, the thing is, this could add up to a lot of money. And of course, not every risk will happen on the project. So the actual amount of money you put aside should be a percentage of the money that you will need, that total amount. So, and the way you calculate how much you'll put aside for any risk is to think about the probability of that risk occurring. And you could say, well, I think it's, we're in the rainy season. Therefore, there could be an 80% probability that we might have rain for this particular, after the excavation is dug. So we might, and yet for another risk, you might say, oh, there's probably only about a 20% chance of that happening. So the money that you are going to put aside, multiply that by the probability of the risk occurring. So if you were going to put $3,000 aside or $4,000 aside for a pump, for pumps to pump out the water, then if you decided that your risk, I'll just make it easy, 75% chance of occurring, that you're going to get rain, then you should put $3,000 aside, not $4,000. And if you've got another risk that might cost you $10,000 to manage if it occurs, but there's only a 10% probability of it occurring, then you would put aside $1,000. So that means you're not putting all the money aside in your contingency fund, you're putting part of it. But that gives you a reserve of money to actually spend on managing risks. And of course, that goes into your overall budget at the beginning of the project. hopefully you won't need to spend that money and you'll have it left over at the end of the project, but it covers you. And particularly if you are doing fixed price work, it's very, very important that you've got all the money to cover these things. Now I'm just going to talk about work health and safety risks. Some of you might already be familiar with this, but Safe Work Australia has put out what they call a hierarchy of control of how you can deal with different work health and safety risks. And this is really important to consider for all the work health and safety risks that you may encounter in your project. And I'll just go through them, and they go from less effective right up to more effective. And you need to choose the level of risk control that you're going to apply. Obviously, there's always a trade-off for cost, again, probability and impact, but there's also practicality involved as well. So, whatever risk control you put in place, it's something that you need to be confident about and also be practical about which control that you decide to use. So if we look at the bottom one, number 6, it is the less effective one. It's using personal protective equipment. And, that could mean wearing gloves and goggles when using a machine, for example. So protecting yourself to some extent. And of course, with COVID, you see in the hospitals, they wear personal protective equipment, with covers and masks, etc., really good masks and shields, gloves, they're fully protected. So personal protective equipment. The next level is administrative controls. So in addition to perhaps using personal protective equipment, you need to train workers. And that could mean training workers on how to use a machine safely. In the example I gave for the personal protective equipment that they wear in hospitals, for example, for COVID, it's also perhaps how to effectively use it, how to use it safely so you don't recontaminate yourself. So there's lots of administrative controls. It's all about training. And so that's very effective. It's no good having just personal protective equipment if you don't really know how to use it and you don't know how to use whatever it is that you're, how to tackle the task you are doing safely. The next step up is using engineering controls. That is reducing the risk by, for example, attaching guards to the machine to protect users. So putting some controls in that are going to stop people from putting their hands in an unsafe place. Put some sort of barrier around things. Another example there would be putting a fence around a deep hole, for example. It's not going to stop people from entering there, but it's going to actually reduce the risk because there is a barrier there that prevents them from just falling in inadvertently. The next one up is isolating the hazard from anyone who could be harmed. So that means keeping the machine, for example, in a closed room and operating it remotely. So quite often, one example that comes to mind is machines. They have little drones that dismantle bombs, for example. You see the police use them. So, that's a really good example of that, where the bomb is isolated. They have a machine that goes to dismantle the bomb, but it's all robotic, and it's actually operated from a distance to keep the people safe. The next one up is substituting the hazard. So it might be that you you provide a safer alternative to doing something. And that could be replacing a machine with a safer version, just doing things in a safer way. So that would be substituting the hazard. And of course, the top one is eliminating the hazard altogether, getting rid of the dangerous machine. Now, eliminating a hazard is not always possible. And that's why I said you've got to be practical and choose the level which is best for your this particular hazard and for your project. So always think of the hierarchy of controls, when you are doing your work health and safety risk assessments. Now, the Safe Work Method Statement, SWMS, is a safety planning tool, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with it. It identifies the hazards and risks of high-risk construction. So it's basically your risk register for work that's particular aspects of work that are being done on the project. It documents the control measures necessary to manage those risks. And by control measures, you can go back to what we just looked at on that previous slide. It's normally prepared by subcontractors or the people doing the work. So every subcontractor needs to have prepared a SWMS and produce that so that the employer can review it and sign it off and make sure that they have got appropriate risk management in place for the specific work they will be doing. So that all contributes to an overall work health and safety risk assessment. Of course, the employer or builder also needs to look at work health and safety risks from their own perspective at the more overall level, because there may be other things that are associated with the site itself that the subcontractors will not consider in their own risk assessments. So very important documentation, the Safe Work Method Statement. Now, managing risk during a project. Now, once you have started your project, and in this case, building, you should make sure you implement all your risk treatments as appropriate, whether they have to be done at the beginning of the project or as a result of trigger points throughout the project. And always monitor those risk treatments to make sure they are working as you expected. Always conduct regular risk reviews. So typically in the building industry, you have daily toolbox meetings, and they specifically to cover things like safety risks on the site and anything that's going to be done during the day. So the toolbox meetings are a really important part of monitoring and reviewing risk on a building project. But also risks should be reviewed at weekly project meetings, and at weekly, if there are site meetings, you would also cover any risks that are there on the site. But also there should be weekly meetings at the project management level to monitor those project-related risks or contractual risks that we talked about before. You should, your other risk register that might be there is there to cover all the things you're doing on your project that are not safety related, but might have financial or schedule impacts to your project. So always remember to keep reviewing those risks as well and putting actions in place as necessarily. WHS audits are also very important on building sites. For an external person, sometimes it might be the contract administrator who goes and does surprise work health and safety audits to make sure that the safety procedures and risk mitigation procedures regarding safety are actually being put into practice. Now, remember too, when you're conducting reviews of risks during the project, things can happen during the project. There may be new risks that emerge during the project. Always make sure that you add those into your risk register, and always analyze those risks and create some risk treatments for those. Also review your treatment plans on a regular basis to make sure that they're still going to be effective. And finally, if there are risks in your register that whether you've got past that point in the project where they couldn't possibly occur, then you can close them off so you don't have to keep looking at them every time. So always monitor that risk register and keep it up to date. So always think about, are those controls that you've got in place effective? Do I need to modify them or put in any new controls? And also keep your work health and safety incident reports there as well, because that's a very important part of monitoring risk and keeping that sort of information at hand. So not only is that there for legislative reasons, but also at the end of the project, you should review those if there were any incidents on your project, so that you could put better controls in next time. Because many big projects, some companies even put on their website that they have zero harm policy, and most big organizations even print that. That's their aim, and every organization should have that aim of zero harm. So WHS needs particular attention. And of course, reporting risks to management. So any risks that are occurring at the time, major risks that are occurring at the time that you're reporting to management, because you should be reporting on a regular basis to your management if you work in a larger organization. Always report any key risks that have come to fruition so that management are aware of these. They don't want surprises. So it's important that you keep management up to date as to what's happening with regarding to your risk management. You don't need to give them the whole risk register. They don't want to be overwhelmed with that. You just need to report any risks that are key and may be happening at the moment or come to fruition or about to come to fruition. Now, toolbox talks, mentioned that a little while ago, is of course, it's a great way to get the team members communicating about workplace hazards before commencing work each day. And it's only a 5 to 10 minute daily safety discussion conducted on site, normally first thing in the morning. It's a means of engaging workers' safety knowledge that you can, and awareness of risks associated with their day-to-day activities, pointing out the hazards on the site, and it encourages an overall safety culture. And it also improves team communication as well, which always helps when there are risky conditions, that people are communicating with each other and perhaps pointing things out to each other during the day. So sample topics that would be discussed during a toolbox talk are things like slips, trips and falls, electrical safety, personal protective equipment such as hard hats, safety about working at heights, and confined space safety are just some sample topics that would be included in Toolbox Talks. Now, at the end of a project, it's important to conduct a review of your risk management. The sort of things you would ask yourself, and also get the people on the team to provide input to this, is how well did we identify risks? In other words, did any risks occur or come up that we didn't include initially but really should have? We should have thought about those things. So did we identify all the risks? And if we didn't, then you need to make a note to put those risks in your checklists for next time. How effective were the treatment plans? So think about all the treatment plans you put in place, and were they effective? If they weren't as effective as they should be, and you might have had to modify them, again, take note of that and remember that for next time. Were there any WHS incidents that could have been avoided? As I said before, always review that incident list and tighten up your procedures for next time. And what can we do better next time? So think about just risk management in general, whether it's WHS or your general project risks or your contractual risks. What can we do better next time to manage risks? So always think about those things that didn't work so well and improve it for next time. And of course, if you did things really well, remember that too, and make sure you do it again next time as well.